Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of .NET Conf. This is going to be super exciting. I'm your host, Leslie Richardson, host of Visual Studio Toolbox. And for the next couple of hours, we're actually going to be talking about how .NET and Visual Studio can work together to make your developer life a lot better. So to kick things off, we're just going to dive right in. I am joined by Vix Ryan and Andy Sterling, both PMs on the Visual Studio team. Welcome, y'all.
Hey, good to see you, Leslie.
Awesome.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Great, me too. So to kick off the morning, they're going to talk about how GitHub and Visual Studio love .NET so much and are there to help make that productivity as a .NET developer better. So I'm going to pass the mic to y'all.
Great, thank you, Leslie. Thanks for the introduction. Like we said, PMs on Visual Studio, so happy to be here. This is my first time speaking at .NET Conf. Really excited to join you all today. And even if we have to be remote, I'm really looking forward to showing you all the wonderful things that we have to share today.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. I'm especially excited to share some of the things that you can be using to get up and running in Codespace today.
Yeah, I am very excited for that. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about, actually. So we have, just like what Andy said, what are Codespaces? What are GitHub Codespaces? How do they work? So I'll be talking a little bit about that and kind of diving into some more details, which we haven't shared in this way before. So I'm really excited to kind of like unveil that and let you all into what's going on behind the curtain with Codespaces. Then we're going to have a demo. I'm going to show you all Codespaces, some cool new things coming out in Visual Studio, and as well as the way that it connects back into GitHub with Visual Studio, Codespaces, and GitHub tooling. And then lastly, we have Andy, who's going to talk through our customizations, which is really cool. And I'm really looking forward to learning, even just like getting a preview of what Andy is sharing around customizations in Codespaces and with Visual Studio all up. I think with that, Andy, did you have anything else to add to the agenda?
No, it sounds very exciting and it's exciting to be here. So I should just get in. I want to see these demos.
Okay, great. Cool. Well, we can just go ahead and hop in then. Thanks, Ryan. That's me. Very excited to be here. Okay, what are Codespaces? When we talk about Codespaces, we think about the way that GitHub Codespaces provides value in a few different areas. From an all-up perspective, we think of GitHub Codespaces as this fully managed, on-demand development environment where you can develop from anywhere and be able to have the power of the cloud in an environment that you know well and love, whether that be Visual Studio, VS Code, or also in our browser experience. The things that come out when you're experiencing Codespaces is that what we've heard from customers in our customer research is that it feels like their local environment. We're going to talk more about that. But that we have this power and this compute in the cloud, so it really opens up the options here for us and what we can do and what our limitations, our previous limitations on what we develop based off of maybe your machine specs are now elevated, and you have access to more essentially. So let's just talk a little bit about what that actually means, because that's pretty high level. When we talk about GitHub Codespaces, there are two aspects that come to mind. And one of the things that we hear from customers in our customer research and our onboarding studies and in all the hours that we spend listening and getting feedback from you all is that there are some times where customers are wanting to know what the difference is between what is in a local scenario and what is in a Codespace. So if you look at this diagram, you think you have this whole section that's cloud hosted where you have your Codespaces. You have essentially the entire VM, whether that be a Windows or Linux-based VM, and it has your compute, your storage, everything that you need as far as the power and this kind of backend behind the Codespace experiences. And then you have this other side, which is the editors. Sometimes we also call these the clients. These are these lightweight UI and this kind of like front end to present the tooling that you know and love through VS Code, the browser, or Visual Studio. So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to focus in on that last one. We're going to focus in on experiences for Visual Studio, for .NET, for in this context that I'm sure many of you have known for even many years. Great, okay. So just to kind of recap a little bit, we have the Codespace. It's this backend hat of the GitHub Codespaces service all up. Gives you everything that you need to get started completing a task, reviewing PRs, using Git tooling, debugging, editor, everything that you are used to in this type of context, right? So let's see how this actually works. So I am going to switch my sharing screen here, and we're going to hop into a demo, which is very exciting. Okay, here we go. Great, everything looks good. Okay, cool. So here we are in Visual Studio. I'm in Visual Studio Preview, Visual Studio 2019. And one thing that I wanted to just point out right off the bat, right? So when we open up our start window, we see this new option here, connect to a Codespace. So that looks very intriguing. You know, I definitely want to click on that in just a second. But I also wanted to draw your attention to, in our most recently used list, we have this option here to connect back to a Codespace as well, or pin it to come back to it later, or keep it at the top of our stack here. So when we're thinking about Codespaces, we're really thinking about how do we make it easy to get back into a Codespace? How do we make it easy to initiate a Codespace in all of these different contexts, right? So here we're going to go ahead and click on connect to a Codespace. And as we're doing this, you know, you'll see a slightly different experience than the first time. With your first time connecting to a Codespace, you can request access to the beta. And then once you have access, you just sign into your GitHub account. So I can just point it out right here, my VixMix GitHub account. And then once I'm signed into my GitHub account, then I get this option here to create a brand new Codespace, which is very cool. One of the things that I do at this point too is I can just go and grab my repository URL from GitHub. I'm going to go to my repositories here, grab this eShop on Web one, drop that down, drop that in, and here I can just quickly clone from my GitHub repository. I can select what type of power I want in my instance type, and this is in this Windows VM. I can select what time it'll suspend. One of the things to also just point out here is that it doesn't go away when it suspends. You know, it just idles for a little bit, and then I can jump back into my context. So I could take a lunch break and come back, and my Codespace would still be up and running. So here we go. Let's go ahead and connect to Codespace. So during this creation process, we see a lot of questions come up around where things are between the kind of boundary lines between Visual Studio and its experience in Codespaces. So some of the things that we're going to point out here too is just how easy it is to initiate the type of tasks that you have in your regular day-to-day, but inside the context of a Codespace. Now, you may have seen when I pulled up my browser here, on the previous screen, I had this tab open for Codespaces. And you can see here that yesterday I created a new Codespace for my sample app, eShop on Web. And you can see that one. And then I can also create one here, which was just created 21 seconds ago, about 47 seconds ago. So here I could also manage this or open in the web. Now, just something to notice here when you are editing here in the browser is that that's using VS Code to have that editing experience in the browser, right? So just think about it as a way to do maybe like lightweight edits and small changes, but maybe not the full development experience that you would have with Visual Studio, right? Because it's in that VS Code environment, but in the browser. So just something to keep in mind. It looks like we have our Codespaces all ready to go, which is great. I even have another one open, so just pointing out that we could have multi-sessions available here. And now that I'm actually in my Codespace, the first thing I'm going to do is here I have my eShop on Web solution open. I'm just going to build and see how this goes, just straight off the bat here. Great, so as this is building, just a little bit about this app that we're running. It's just a .NET kind of like shopping cart system, a little website, and it looks like it's built successfully, which is great. I'm going to trust, and here we go. Great, so now it's already up and building. So it's pretty cool actually. So all I did was clone my repository in a Codespace. Here I have my app running in a Codespace building, and I can already start interacting with it. And that was within minutes, a minute, I don't know, very quick, which is awesome. One of the things that I was given a tip from Andy to go and check out was that there's this little bug happening where when we added something to our cart, it looks like the image is broken. So I'm just going to investigate that and take a look at it in my Codespace. I'm gonna go ahead and stop debugging. And I noticed that when Andy pointed it out, he was talking about something about the basket view model service. So I'm going to just pull that up, and here in my control Q, and there we go. Go ahead and pull up that file. I really like using control Q for a lot of different things. Anytime that I feel a little bit lost or like I'm not sure how to find a particular piece of code in my solution, I use control Q. If I'm looking for a new type of feature and wanting to point that out, then I also use control Q. So I'd recommend giving it a go. And as you could see, as we were typing in, we could also do code search here, which is really cool. So here I am in basket view model service. I'm going to scroll down, and it looks like I got this little tip about the get basket items function. So here I can just go ahead and set a breakpoint and go through just a basic debugging experience and start checking these things out. Just keeping an eye on the time to not get too deep into it. I actually know where, I'm pretty confident I know where this issue is. So I am going to look down here where we have the picture URL. And it looks like we have name here, which is not that helpful. So I'm going to instead, change it to picture URI. All right, sweet, looks good. Save. And now I want to point out something else that's really cool about some new changes in Visual Studio. There's this new tab here that's called Get Changes. And I have been really enjoying this new Git tooling a lot, actually, because I just find that like when I have to go into terminal to make my Git changes, sometimes like I just feel a little bit lost or excuse me, just finding kind of like my footing each time, when I'm getting in there can sometimes be a little bit confusing. And especially when I'm switching back from a UI-based navigation, like with Solution Explorer, and then back into terminal and back and forth. So the Git changes tooling has been really, really helpful in this. So here you can see I already have my changes. I'm just going to go ahead and commit this because I'm pretty confident I know what's going on. We have like an inside scoop here. So here we can see the commit here, and I can also go up into the top here, navigation, where we see Git, and I can open up my manage branches and see what's going on here too. And I can easily push. So here I get this cool visualization. I get to know what everybody's been doing. I get to see my activities, which is, again, really good for myself as a visual thinker. So this has been really nice and made it a lot easier for me to make changes that I need. So then I can just create a pull request easily and make this change, which looks good. I'm actually going to save that for later so that I know we get to everything that I want to show. So here, another thing that I wanted to point out was that we have some really cool new tooling around the way that GitHub interacts with Visual Studio inside the context of Codespace as well, and outside of it. One of the things that has been really interesting to try out is this right-click publish. And the option here, we have this new option to publish directly with GitHub Actions, which has been very interesting and cool. You can see that I've already made one, so I'm just going to create a new one to show you what it looks like. So here I can just select Azure, yeah, Windows, looks good. I could create a new resource group if I want to. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, great. Looking good, looking easy. So when in the kind of like the next option here, we're going to be able to see the kind of like last bit where we have this option to publish through GitHub Actions. And I want to show you as well where that shows inside of the context of my repository. So here I'm in my Bixmix fork of the eShop demo app, and you can see here in my workflows under actions that I actually already have one, spoiler alert, but here I could go ahead. And so the CI/CD, this availability to extend my workflow past just my inner loop activities through GitHub and GitHub Actions has been really, really cool to play with and figure out. Here, let's go ahead and hit next. So here is where you can go ahead and publish automatically using GitHub Actions. So just wanted to throw that in there. I would recommend, if you all wanted to try it out, let us know how it goes. We are very much looking forward to hearing all of the feedback from Codespaces, from the context of our new Git tooling with GitHub Actions, and trying to really develop this cohesive relationship between all of these different aspects of our great, powerful tooling. So with that, just keeping an eye on the time, making sure that we are going. I think that is what I wanted to show as far as in the Codespace context. One last thing that I'll point out is that you do have access to your same kind of collaboration tooling as far as live share and what you might need as far as collaborating with teammates too. So I could quickly grab this link from in my environment, share it with Andy. He could jump into it. He could start exploring it. He could do his own publish, all with that same type of collaboration tooling, which we know has been, and what we've heard from customers has been really helpful inside of the context of this kind of this quick transition to a remote first environment that's brought its own challenges along the way. One of the things that has been really interesting as far as like the way that we as a team with Visual Studio and GitHub and Codespaces have been thinking about how we make that, how we meet you all where you need support or help or tooling around those different aspects of collaboration. So I'm really excited to get into Andy's portion as well, because we're going to be talking about the way that teams are able to use different types of customizations to set up their environment so that it's just quick and easy to run through in the way that it was for me, but also even in more depth of customizations as well. So let's go ahead and pull this back up and do a little recap. What did we talk about? we talked about creating a code space. We talked about Git changes. We did some code navigation. We debugged within a code space, collaboration tooling, and GitHub Actions. All of this has been a really cool learning experience from having conversations with everyone as far as what the development looks like around how do we make sure that this tooling is providing a solution, a possible solution to a need that we're hearing from everyone and our customers. So why use GitHub Codespaces? You can quickly create them. You can delete them if you don't want them. You can have this managed environment that's just easy to spin up, get going, burn down if you don't want it anymore. This predictable pricing structure you pay for what you use, and you save these compute resources. So the way, when I first started working remotely in this, like I was on my little laptop that I used for jumping from meetings or traveling to conferences or that type of thing. And it was getting pretty hard to work on larger repositories in Visual Studio. So using Codespaces has made that a lot easier because, like we talked about in the way that Codespaces works, it removes that aspect for us of having to have all of that processing power and that compute on your machine. In fact, it just removes it and just creates you to this experience where you're able to just use the UI that you are familiar with. So even as I was pulling it up, you could see my dark screen. You could see the way that I like to have my development environment set up. So all of that felt nice and familiar, and that's what we've been hearing from customers as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead, and I'd like to pass off to Andy as far as what does customizing a code space mean? How do we do that? What are the details? Andy, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for some great demos that help highlight the value of code spaces and how you can use them. So as Vix mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how you can customize a code space. And firstly, you're probably thinking, what on earth does that mean? Well, customizing a code space is all about getting you up and productive in an environment as soon as possible. Like Vix mentioned, one of the really nice value props of code spaces is to be able to write code, build code, run code, debug code as soon as possible. I'm sure many of you have had an experience in the past where you start a new project, start on a new team, and you clone the repository down, and you try pressing F5 and it doesn't work. You have to get some other stuff. Maybe the repository was super nice and it had a nice markdown file that defined exactly what you needed to do. Or maybe, just maybe, there wasn't such a file and it was all in Bob's head. And half the challenge was just going to find Bob and extracting how on earth to set up this project such that you could run and build it. And so really we want to tackle that problem. We want to make it so it's easy for you as a developer to create a development environment in a code space so you can be productive. So the next person that comes along can have that experience where they just hit F5, boom, kind of like magic, it works. So how are we going to do that? Well, firstly, it isn't actually magic. There isn't such a thing as far as I'm aware. So what we really need is your help in defining these development environments. Like one of the challenges with a code space is because they're automatically created or programmatically created, I should say, in the cloud in Azure, they can't rely on a person going to a wiki page, copying a link to an MSI or Googling for how to install Python to install it. It has to be defined. If you can imagine this compute environment starts off as a blank canvas, we need your help as a developer to fill that in, to paint that picture, to tell us what your application needs. And so this is the tough part. For the first person, the first time, someone has to go through and kind of define what on earth that this repository needs to be able to successfully build, run, and of course debug and things like that. And once that's done, everyone else benefits. Obviously yourself, if in the future you decide to create a new code space or a new virtual machine, but anyone else joining your team and working on your project gets to benefit from that work of defining this development environment. And that's really the key trick here, is the key trick is really around defining that development environment. And what we want to do with Codespaces is to give you some new tools to make that easier, both in the case of Codespaces, but also in the future locally with regular Visual Studio. So before we get too deep into how to define these environments, it's really worth hammering home something that Vic's already talked to, which is a code space is kind of a story of two halves. There's your local experience, and for this talk, I'm really just focused on Visual Studio. There's the Visual Studio client, the EXE you run locally, and that connects up to that resource in Azure. And the resource, the compute resource up in Azure is where all the magic, or I should say magic, all the hard work is done. Like that's where your repository is, that's where the files are, that's where it's going to build, that's where it's going to run. And that's also where lots of services from Visual Studio are. So some of the computationally expensive stuff from VS, like language services, debugging service, and all those sort of things run up in the Azure compute, and your client is connecting to them to utilize them. That sounds great. And like you said, like Vic's mentioned, it's a great way to get scalability because it means your client has to do a lot less. But one interesting challenge this presents immediately as a developer who's probably used to Visual Studio and Windows for some time is that you don't have some of the familiar tools. Like you can't use File Explorer, for example, Windows Explorer, just to navigate to files and stuff like that. And you can't do what you might do locally to install stuff. You can't just browse the internet, download an MSI and run it and click, yes, I agree a couple of hundred times after reading the very long EULA. That's not possible in this option. In this world, you have to use Visual Studio as your window into the compute in the cloud. So all the features and capabilities of Visual Studio will be there. They're not all there right now. But certainly some of the big ones, such as the terminal. So if you've used Visual Studio for some time, you might know we have an integrated terminal using PowerShell or Console, which is a great tool locally. But in the case of a Codespace, it's really important because that tool is how you execute and interact directly with the compute environment. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you are using like a terminal, it's a bit cumbersome to use that every time. So one thing you want to think about is that ultimately, we want to get everything that defines your development environment into your Git repository. Your Git repository is the artifact of everything about your project. It should be the one source of truth for your project, and that includes what is needed to set it up. So if you depended on someone installing something like Python 2.7 for some reason, then that should be captured somewhere in that repo so that someone else, and in this case, the Codespace, can know about it. And so what we're going to talk about next is how you can customize these code spaces for Windows and Visual Studio. So when I say customization, it's probably not a term everybody uses. So what we really mean here is doing anything with the compute environment such that it's specific to your repository. So that can be installing software, like a completely new software, such as like SQL Server or Redis or RabbitMQ or anything like that. It could be something, a Windows capability, enabling IIS, for example. Anything to change that in the compute environment to be more specific to your particular repository and your application. So if you think about how the customizations are structured inside a Codespace, it's like a layer cake. At the bottom, what you have is the base image. This is the very base thing that is shared amongst everybody. So it has nothing to do with your repository. Every single customer of a Visual Studio Codespace will get this. And that base image is built on Windows 10, Windows 10 client, and it has Visual Studio 2019 installed on top of it. So that gives you a ton of capabilities off the bat. Obviously with Windows, your application may be using any number of APIs, and Visual Studio delivers a bunch of dependencies such as, SQL Express, local DB, as well as languages and tools and SDKs and runtimes. And one thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned that, is that ultimately you do want to make sure that you don't rely on what's in this base image. Like this base image today has a set of capabilities, but tomorrow it might have a different set of capabilities. For example, Windows could update and add or remove or change a feature or version it so that the version you're depending upon is no longer programmatically API compatible. And the same could happen with the dependencies Visual Studio is bringing along. And so if there's one thing to take away from this entire little section, it's that the most valuable thing for you to as a developer is to define your development environment such that someone else can reproduce it without having to install the same version of Windows 10 as you, or Visual Studio with the same workloads, etc. So with that being said, the next two pieces of customization come from your repository. Like I mentioned, the Git repository that you have is your real only pipeline into the system. And so everything has to really come through that. As Vic showed in the Visual Studio UI, there wasn't a place to enter any random stuff. There was just repository, idle time, and the type of SKU, and off you go. So there are two things that you can put in your repository. The first is a .devcontainer.json. So you may have heard of this file. You may even already have one in your repository for use in Visual Studio Code. So VS Code has a remote container development story and has done for some time, which is fantastic. We are starting to reuse some of that. This might change its name. As the warning says at the top of the slide, this stuff is still in beta and preview, so some stuff is subject to change. And this naming is a bit confusing because we're not running in a container. So all the Docker and container related properties that you might be used to if you're using a devcontainer.json from VS Code are not applicable in a Visual Studio and Windows code space. The most important thing that is the post create command. And this is probably the major thing to put in this file. And all that does is it's a property in the JSON file called post create command. You'll see a demo of it later. That will execute a series, an array of commands you provide as strings in the default shell, which in Windows, of course, is the console command as admin. So that's the first way you can customize, really, is you can execute a script after the repository has been cloned. And so if you already have the script that does that locally, then you just plumb that in there and you're good to go. Job's done. But if you don't have that script that deploys your environment and creates all the stuff necessary for a developer to be productive, that's where we're introducing a new tool, a tool called devinit. And devinit is a tool to help you define and create development environments on Windows. It's something it's just in preview. It's for Codespaces right now, and we're looking at how moving it to Visual Studio for local experiences in the future. But right now, it's part of Codespaces. And what is it? Well, it's a command line tool. Devinit is starting off as a command line tool. It's on path in a code space. And really what it is a tool that drives other tools. So apologies if there's too many layers of tooling there. I just couldn't think of better words. It's a meta tool, maybe that's a word to use, that drives these other little tools to actually do work to install. You can almost think of it like as a recipe or as a checklist of stuff your application needs. So in this tool, devinit can be used to install software. And the principal way it works is you as a developer define a JSON file. So up here on the right, you can see that I've got this JSON file, and that's that little recipe that you're going to define that says my application needs these things. And then with devinit, you can just run it from the command line and execute a command called init. And what that will do is take these specific tools and then execute them. And do whatever action of each of those tools. And that's what we're going to look at a bit more today in a demo, is how to use these tools and which tools to use. But with that, with this JSON file and with this devinit in it, you can install software, configure things that will be the foundation of your development environment, such your application can build and run. And that's the most critical thing, is that you can define what your dependencies are, and it's simple to use JSON file that in the future will hopefully provide better tooling for integration into Visual Studio, etc. And so that's a bit of one of the reasons we went for JSON, and it could have been YAML, it could have been it could have been XML if this was the 90s. But the reason is that it allows us to have some tooling on top of it. If you write a script and you already have a script, then you should just use that. But scripts are very difficult for other tools to interact with because it's basically a black box. It executes some stuff and it can literally do anything. It's very hard to know what the underlying things your tool was trying to achieve or the state it was trying to achieve if it's just a script. So that's why we got this JSON file. You can check it into a repository and it can flow along with the rest of your code. And so, like I mentioned, this devinit tool itself is really just driving these other smaller tools to do actual work. So let's talk about what they look like. So yeah, each of the tools is just a wrapper. So in devinit, we just have a bunch of wrappers that call into another tool, because one of the beautiful things about the Windows ecosystem is there's at least 20 ways of doing everything, especially when it comes to installing software. There's many ways that Windows has been configured over time. I'm sure many of you might already have things like a packages config file for Chocolatey, or you might already have an MSI, or you might already be using foo technology. There's lots of great ways to install stuff on on Windows. And what devinit is trying to do is to use those things. So for example, today, if you were locally to use an MSI to install, so you download your MSI, you run it, we have a tool that will take the URI for that MSI and execute it. So you just pass in like a URI to the MSI tool, and then it calls into MSI exec or some other tool that actually does the heavy lifting. Devinit is not actually, it doesn't actually do the installation itself. It relies on something else. And we'll look at that a little bit more. But the key thing is it's just really a shim to something else. We want you as a developer to bring the technologies you already have and plug them into this world. So we don't really want to build a whole new package distribution system. This is not a Winget or apt-get or Chocolatey or anything like that. It's not about, devinit is not a package distribution system. It's just a thing that really can be used to poke those things so that we know that they're there. So if you're using one of those package managers and stuff like that, you can just write this in a JSON file so that the Codespaces knows where to go to get that stuff and execute it. Like if you, for example, in your application, you probably use like npm and NuGet as a package manager, and those are brilliant things, obviously, and absolutely great. And devinit is not addressing those problems. What it's trying to solve is, well, who told me to get npm? Like, obviously, you have to install Node for that to happen. So we're just trying to, I guess at the meta level, inception, trying to solve the challenge of how do you get the first layer of tools if you start from a blank canvas? And how do you paint that so that the rest of the ecosystem, like NuGet and stuff, can all just work? So yeah, how do you use it? Well, we talked about this a bit. So the first step, and we'll do a quick demo of this, is you need to add a devinit JSON file that defines what your application needs to run, debug, and build. This is the 99% of the work. This is basically all of the work, is figuring out what your application needs, which may sound trivial, like, oh, I know my application, I know everything it needs. But there's a few gotchas, specifically around things that, ultimately you want to make sure that the definition you create, works on the basis that there's a blank canvas to some degree. Like for example, if your application depends on something that Visual Studio is bringing, like if Visual Studio is bringing a specific version of the .NET Core SDK, and you rely and depend on that because you've pinned using global JSON or something like that, then what happens when Visual Studio no longer brings that? Like, for example, you could get into a situation where your application is specifically for reasons that, your application is taking its dependency on, using an old version of like the SDK framework, sorry, the .NET Core SDK, but Visual Studio's moved on beyond it. Like, future versions of Visual Studio won't ship with like the 2.0 SDK and stuff like that. And if you've pinned to that, how do you get that back? So that's a big thing to keep in mind, is that in some cases, Visual Studio may already be bringing a lot of your dependencies with you, especially, if you're coming from a C++ world where there's C++ tool sets. Obviously Visual Studio is probably what you use to install those today. And you might have had an experience in the past where you've updated your version of Visual Studio and maybe it deployed the latest, like the 142 tool set, and then poof, your app didn't build anymore. So the thing there is to think about not just the obvious stuff the app depends on, like, oh, hey, it's got SQL Server because, you install SQL Server, or it's got IIS because you have a script that deploys and installs IIS. But think about other things that your application might need, like even simple stuff, like you probably assume you have something like Node installed locally because you can't live without Node to do front-end development these days. But Node might not always be available in the servers. And even worse, if you depend on a specific version of it, and this is probably more true for Python and other languages, then that version may not be there by default. So again, this is the hard task, is figuring out what your application needs, defining that in a JSON file, and then you just hook it up to the dev container JSON. So let's look at this in Visual Studio. So I was working on the same eShop app as Vix was showing earlier. And so this time around, though, I'm going to show you the customization story. So the couple things to note is that in the Solution Explorer here, we have a .devcontainer.json in the root, and a .devinit JSON, and we're going to work on this JSON file first. So just mentally going through my head, I know my application requires the .NET Core SDK, but how do I get that? Like, how do I tell devinit that that's the specific version I need? Or how do I even use, know about this tool and stuff? Well, the truth of the matter is we're going to have to use the internet, and we're going to have to search. And the best way to do this is just to search for, like, if you just search for devinit and docs, you should be taken to our documentation. And this is going to sound a bit cheese-tastic, but using the documentation and the samples is probably the best way to get started. Obviously, we have some documentation that talks about everything and things like that. But the hard problem you have to go through is to map a dependency, a concrete dependency your app needs, like the .NET Core SDK, back to a tool in devinit that actually installs that thing. So, like, how do you install SQL? How do you install Python, or whatever other dependencies you need? And so the first place to start is probably this tool list page, where this lists out all the tools we currently have in devinit for doing things like, installing VC packages and enabling Windows features, etc. But in this particular case, like I'm just going to be cheeky and just Google for .NET. And if you search find a page, not Google, you can see that there's a tool to install the .NET SDK, and that's what I want. And so this is the challenge, is mapping what you need to a tool in devinit. So here you can see there's a tool called require.NET Core SDK, and obviously this is the documentation for it. And you can see some examples here. And the easiest example is if I just take just the name of the tool, and if you go back to the JSON file, you see the structure of the file is to have this one property called run and an array, which contains a set of objects. And those objects are the tools to execute. So we're just going to do this with a default, because we know we need the .NET Core SDK, and that will install it. The next tool we need is the .NET Entity Framework tool. As Vix mentioned, this tool uses a database, and that requires uses the Entity Framework Core. And so we need the .NET tools, the Entity Framework tools, to perform things like migrations and stuff like that. And so again, you can search here. There we go. And you can see the documentation here. It's like, oh, just the name of the tool, plus, like in this case, we can make it global so I can use it everywhere. Great. Okay. That's done. So if I go back to Visual Studio, so we add that tool. And so we've got the name of the tool here, the input. And again, because the way that the devinit is structured, these tools are really just shims to something else. So in the case of the .NET Tool Installer, it's a shim to the .NET Tool Install command that you probably run from a PowerShell or whatever. And so here we pass the name of the tool along with some additional options, which are specific to the tool. But one other thing I want to add is I know this tool, this eShop on Web, like I mentioned, uses database. It's using local DB in my particular example. And that local DB is today delivered via Visual Studio. My Visual Studio installs local DB in a couple of workloads, but say in the future it doesn't, or say you decide not to have that workload, you should specify that, like, hey, I want to install local DB. And so what I can do is I can go back to this, and one of the challenges of local DB is there isn't a specific tool that will install local DB, but there is things like an MSI tool that will obviously take the MSI for local DB and execute it silently and accept all the prompts and stuff in the background. And there's also, if you prefer, like we currently have a tool for Chocolatey, so you can also use Chocolatey to install it. So if I just did that, you can see that all I need to do is pass in the name of the tool to install. And so there's an example using MongoDB. So we can use Chocolatey to deliver the tool. And since I'm using Visual Studio and have a schema for the JSON file, you can see that you get IntelliSense as you'd expect. And so let me just copy the name of the SQL DB tool, which you get from as a Chocolatey package. And see, that's the JSON file. So with that, I could, from a command prompt, just run it. Like if we just list here, you'll see that in the current path, in the root of the repo, is the .dev container JSON. So if I run .devinit, and if I can learn to spell, what will happen is we'll go through this, and it will go through and install all the things we need, which is great. You can also, for what it's worth, pass in with a specific location. So if you put your devinit.json wherever that you want, like in a specific per project location, you can pass in the location with -f. And of course, there's help. So there's command line help as well as in the documentation. So with this done, I now have the dependencies my application needs to run. So there's a couple other things I want to do. I want to hook it up to dev container JSON using that post create command. But before I do that, there's one more thing I need to do. I want to create a PowerShell script that will execute a couple of other things, because I know that even once I've got stuff installed, there's some commands that need to be ran. And that devinit is not a place to execute commands like you would in PowerShell or Terminal or wherever. So here I've got a PowerShell script, and I'm just going to use it to run those 2 update commands, which will perform the migrations that will get the database ready for whoever's going to press F5. And then what I do is in the dev container JSON, I call PowerShell, since, like I mentioned, it executes in the default shell of your application of the OS, which on Windows is command. So I want to call PowerShell, and then because the default behavior on PowerShell is to require signing, I need to put the execution policies unrestricted. So that's tip number 1. And the second tip is don't forget to add the / at the start, so that it's unambiguous if you meant a script or a built-in command to PowerShell. And so with that, when Vix created a code space, this command executed and installed the software, ran the database migrations, and so that you could just press F5 and off and running without any more work from the person creating the code space. So we went from having instructions like this to basically no instructions. And again, of course, as your application gets more complicated, you can obviously version and increase, add or remove dependencies from this file. So that was the demo. We talked about this quite a bit. So again, you have a JSON file where you define your dependencies, and each tool has a specific behavior. And you should really look at our documentation. We're thinking about how to build better visual tooling and some integration to Visual Studio, but for now, it's JSON. So you have to look at the docs, and then you execute the devinit command. There's also a way to run a single tool if you want to test it, for example, where you can just go devinit run and pass in the name of the tool. And yeah, this is what it all looked like. You put in your dev container JSON a link to a PowerShell script that called devinit init, and then whatever per repository commands you need to execute. And then lastly, a devinit JSON, which had a list of all those things to execute to pull down the dependencies you need. And again, there's a bunch of tools there right now. Some of them are very open, like an MSI installer, which can be used to literally install anything. And some of them are very specific to Windows, like a enable Windows feature. So if you enable to enable specific capability of Windows. So yeah, so just a recap of what I've talked about. The biggest thing is to go away and think about how you define your environment in a way it can be reproduced. Devinit is a tool to help you to do that, so that it's easy for you as a developer, if you don't already have something, and if to define a JSON file that captures the dependencies of your application, such that it'd be super easy for someone later to go and deploy them. And this is just one option. There's many options of how to do this. Like I mentioned, if you have a script, you're good to go. If your application is solely container-based, that's fantastic. And there's many infrastructure code solutions for containers that you can use. But for those who have a Windows application, this is a new option. And really, the call to action here is, check it out. This is a really early tool. We're just testing it now in Codespaces. We aspire for it in preview 2 of 16.9 of Visual Studio to ship inside the developer command prompt of VS, so that you can use it locally, because that will make things like testing and using the tool much easier. One, you won't have to run the Codespaces beta, and two, when things do go wrong, which occasionally may happen, it's much easier to use Windows, like the Event Manager and all the tools you have locally to diagnose those. So check out the docs, and more importantly, there's a survey here to get some feedback information, because we'd love to hear from you. We want to make sure this tool is solving your problems. It has the features and the capabilities necessary for you to deploy and create your environments, so that it's easy to get onboarded and started with a code space. Yeah. So Vix, I think it's back over to you. My rant's now complete. Sorry.
Yeah. That was great. It was great. I'm so intrigued by the new tooling that's coming along. I'm excited to see what comes out for the local experiences as well, and enabling those as well, because I've been playing with it in a code space for a while now, and I'm like, ooh, okay, how would this also work inside of my local experiences? But it's been really interesting to hear from folks in onboarding studies, like in the way that you and I have also watched just hours and hours of customers going through setting up these customizations. So I not just the customizations, but the code spaces. And so it's cool to get even more in depth and detail of how devinit customizations and using that across the board of Visual Studio, also inside of the context of a code space, can provide value. So definitely interested in hearing what folks have to think about that. Cool. Okay, let's pull back up that slide and let's look at some of our call to actions for Codespaces. So to sign up for GitHub Codespaces with Visual Studio, like we mentioned, it is in beta. If you would going and trying it out, there may be things that there will be things that will shift and change. We are definitely taking all types of feedback from folks. So you'll want to download Visual Studio Preview, and there's a link to it there. You want to sign up for the GitHub Codespaces beta, and then we will add you to that access. And then also, if you want to learn more about GitHub and Azure integration and GitHub Actions, we also have a resource there to learn more about that as well. So that kind of like last bit of what we talked about. So those are the main things on your to-do list. If you are interested in Codespaces, if it sounds like something that would be helpful for you, or even if you just want to go try it out because it's free and you can just do it, please give it a go and let us know what you think. We are on Twitter. We will talk to you about it. So for the last slide, also just wanted to take this kind of step back and a broader look too at what's coming out and what's new in Visual Studio all up. It's not just the context of Codespaces, but all up. So let's go to the next slide.
Oh, that was me. Sorry.
That's okay. You're doing great.
It's okay. That's charming. Let's see if the slide is still there.
Yeah, that's great.
All right.
Good.
PowerPoint has froze on me. So, all right.
Okay.
There.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. We love live. Okay, awesome. So just to show here with the with some of the things that are coming out for Visual Studio all up in 16.8 GA and 16.9 preview. So here we have your AI assisted productivity. So that is in IntelliCode. We have the team completions portion of it as well. So getting your own suggestions as far as what the custom models for your team, and then sharing that with your team, those custom models. Like we talked about inside of the preview, we have GitHub Actions workflow for your .NET Core apps. Like we also talked about in the demo, we have these Git workflows. We would love for you to try those out and give us some feedback. I'm admittedly a fan, but I would so like to hear if there are things that you feel like still need to be added or changed, even just comparing to the previous like Team Explorer experience as well. .NET Productivity, the Roslyn analyzers, and the .NET Code Styler analyzers, also in preview for that last one. And we have some Linux, .NET Core debugging, and debug with Linux core dumps. So, and lastly, we have this XML diagnostics improvements. So if you would like to go try those out, update, try 16.8 GA, try and install and installing the preview for 16.9, and please give us feedback. So either through developercommunity.com, through Twitter, you have our handles. We are happy to hear from you, and it's really valuable. We spend a lot of our time just listening and asking questions to better understand where we are helping improve and where we have room to improve ourselves. So
yeah. And just a quick plug, the next talk I think is Mark Downey, and he'll be covering some of the diagnostics things you just mentioned. So stick around for that.
That's awesome. We love Mark. That's great. Okay, cool. I think we can probably, it looks like we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Yeah, over to you, Leslie.
Yes, we do. So thank you, both of you, for that awesome talk. There was a lot of content that I thought was very interesting, and clearly the viewers did too, because we have a lot of responses and questions from Twitter. So one of the biggest questions that's being asked a lot is regarding Codespaces support and what is supported. So we have E. Brosman, forgive me if I'm messing up names here and there, but anyway, we have DevSpeed and E. Brosman asking if Codespaces support desktop development, Azure DevOps, and we also have Jeremy Sinclair asking about mobile development. So what are the different things that Codespaces supports today?
So firstly, we can talk a little bit about the Azure DevOps support. So the way that we're thinking about, we want to provide options for customers to be able to work in repositories that they know and love. I think that as we're going through the beta, we're learning a lot about what aspects of that in Azure DevOps we can provide and continue to provide. Today, you can, in the beta, go and create a code space with an Azure DevOps URL and repository. There are definitely things that we're still figuring out inside of our research and that are subject to change around what we're learning with that type of support as well. But if you'd like to go give it a go right now, you can absolutely do that today, and let us know what you think, and let us know what you want. So great question. And also we're still learning and kind of shifting and iterating on what is going to be in kind of the final version of Codespaces as well. So that's for the Azure DevOps question. Great question. Andy, do you want to take the other part?
Yeah, so I think the other part of this was really around like, hey, do we support desktop and mobile in Codespaces? And so right now, we're really just starting with ASP.NET Core and .NET Core projects, so like libraries and console apps. That's the first place we're starting. And then alongside that, perhaps not so relevant to this conference, but we also have support for some C++, like cross-platform applications using CMake and stuff like that. So those are the kind of two beachheads that we're starting with, two project types. We're obviously appreciating a lot of developers who are using things like desktop or mobile or other things that aren't covered by those two. But those are the two we're starting with. And, as Vic's mentioned, we're keen to hear feedback on the scenarios you have for outside those two and where we should go next. And the request for desktop and mobile has definitely been heard loud and clear.
Awesome. So other questions we got, Jay McCormick and DeVito asked, will Codespaces be extended to third-party repos like Bitbucket or on-prem repositories?
Excellent question. So as far as so two parts to that. The way that we have Codespaces set up today, I don't feel like that the on-prem repositories would be something that we would tackle anytime in the near future. As far as the third party too, we're really wanting to create experiences that expand on the tooling that we have access to. So with GitHub, like we talked about with creating a kind of like further experience with GitHub Actions, or the way that we can also have Codespaces in the browser context through github.com. That's where our focus is right now. As far as the other third-party repositories, we have heard that from customers, like with Bitbucket, very much heard. As far as where we're going to go next with what we support, I think we're also, similarly to what Andy said, we're trying to get a good base core experience for Codespaces first inside of the context of GitHub, and also adding in some of this Azure DevOps support. And then once we have that as a solid foundation and knowing that it's working well for folks, then I think we can start exploring research around what other types of repositories we may or may not support. But today it's focusing in on those two.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything to add to that too? Or?
Not at the moment. I think the on-prem thing is interesting. Like I kind of talked about, like Codespaces don't have access today to on-premise resources, but this is something that we're aware of as a challenge. Like you might have a SQL Server you're sharing, for example, amongst your peers. And so this is definitely something we'd love to hear more about, because bringing in access to on-prem resources brings in all sorts of interesting complexities in terms of management of resources and things like that. So that's definitely something you can reach out, and I think something we'll be actively researching about how we enable those scenarios.
Yeah, good points.
Okay. Up next on the topic of devinit, Jug Harton and D. Morazanato ask, can you run a devinit to set up a local machine? And also, is there a way to get the base image used by GitHub Codespaces to locally test devinit configuration?
Yeah, so on the first question on the local side, yes, we plan to ship devinit as part of Visual Studio in the 16.9 timeframe, hopefully for preview 2. But we definitely realize that shipping it locally is a great way to test, because when you're creating that JSON file, it's nice to have a small loop rather than go to Codespace and try it every time. So that's definitely there. For the base image is not available. We do list out what software it has. So there's documentation if you search for Visual Studio Codespaces in Windows, and we'll list out all the stuff we have in the version. But the image itself isn't available because it's a sys-pressed image that has license key and stuff associated with it. But the list of software is there, and you could reproduce that. And I can look actually at sharing either a devinit file or some other file that allow you to create that image. And so you could just mount it locally in Hyper-V. But we don't share the direct images.
All right. And I think we have time for one more question. Andreas Fredrickson asked, is it really worth getting into GitHub if you're just working alone? What are the perks of using GitHub when you're the lone writer of your development?
That's a great question. I can think of a couple off the bat. I think that there was a long time where I was using GitHub and just as an individual going through different testing applications and different samples and learning in that context. You still have access to the other additions of tooling, even just inside of a code space, and how as an individual working alone, I'm not sure what this particular person's context is, but even when I am primarily working alone, doing work for a nonprofit or grassroots organizations, I have to switch context quite a bit because there will be maybe a small update on this app or an update over here. And I find that Codespaces has provided value for jumping context, even in the context of just being the kind of sole developer on the project. So that's something that comes to mind for me. Interested, Andy, if you have thoughts as well.
Yeah, I always think back to college, makes me so old now. Disaster recovery. I don't understand the full context here, but having your source code in a place that can be accessed from other machines is always very useful, both for history control, so you can see revisions, you can go back in time and see stuff like that. So I'm not sure if the question was about GitHub as much as source control. 100% source control, there's so many good options, free and otherwise, to have source control. So you definitely have that. GitHub specifically, frankly, it's just the best place for source control out there. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
All right. Great. Well, thank you two so much for that very informative talk. And they listed their calls to action as to how you can learn up on all these cool new tools such as Codespaces and devinit. And with that, thank you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you. Enjoy your rest of the day, everyone.
Yeah.
Sweet.